Greetings, Earthlings, and welcome back to my channel. Today, we are going to be talking about the sinking of the Howard S Gerken, a sand dredge that met its watery fate in Lake Erie in the year 1926. The Gerken has a pretty interesting history, and since I'm writing about it for my job, I thought I would make a video about it too in case anyone wanted to learn more. So, without further ado, here's the history of the Howard S Gerken and the story of its sinking. Though the Howard S Gerken was not built until 1918, our story today starts in 1910 in Winnipeg, Manitoba, with the construction of a ship called the Rosamond Billet. Commissioned by Hugh Sutherland of the Canadian Northern Railway, the Rosamond Billet was a steel-hulled, self-propelled dredge that was meant to operate locally in Lake Erie. She was 163.5 feet in length and boasted twin screws along with two condensing compound engines that had 366 indicated horsepower. Fully loaded, she could carry up to 1,000 tons of sand and gravel. She was launched at Winnipeg into the waters of the Red River on October 10th, 1910. Interestingly enough, there is no record of Hugh Sutherland or the Canadian Northern Railway operating the Rosamond Billet. On February 28, 1911, the boat was sold to the Lake Winnipeg Shipping Company and proceeded to undergo a severe facelift which included, but was not limited to, the bow being cut back to a sharper angle, the stern being cut flat, and the ship being fitted with 3 storage hoppers, along with a complicated series of pipes and valves. Also in 1911, it was recorded that the Lake Winnipeg Shipping Company was constructing a dock on the banks of the Red River. It was at this dock that they housed the Rosamond Billet for several years, where it sat unused and neglected until 1917, when it was dismantled. Most parts acquired from the requisition were shipped east, but the hull remained mostly intact. Many countries were now in the throes of World War I, and the shipping industry on the Great Lakes was struggling. There was a great need for cargo-carrying vessels on the lakes, but the U.S. government had requested use of the larger, better-made vessels, leaving the sailors of the 1910s struggling to keep up with the demand put upon them. They needed more boats. And so, Canadian Steamship Lines, one of the companies who needed extra transport, acquired ownership of the Rosamond Billet's hull, along with some other materials, and managed to build a new boat while using the old one as a frame. They named this new boat the T.P. Phelan, and launched her in late July of 1918. The Phelan, which would one day be renamed the Howard S Gerken, was an impressive 241 feet in length, with engines larger than those on the Billet, generating over 700 indicated horsepower. She became a transport ship, her main job being to carry grain from Port Colborne and Kingston down to the St. Lawrence River. In her time as the T.P. Phelan, the ship faced its share of troubles. On July 27, 1919, she ran aground on Fraser's Shoal and had to be removed via the efforts of 2 tugboats. Thankfully, she suffered no severe damage from this grounding and continued to operate unimpeded until August 17, 1920, when she was involved in a serious accident. She was carrying tons of bushels of wheat when it is supposed that her steering gear failed, which caused her to run aground on the rocky shore of Iroquois Point. Unlike her first grounding, this one wrecked her hull, and the T.P. Phelan sank in the shallow waters of Ontario. The crew, surprisingly, did not abandon ship. They actually stayed aboard, sleeping on the open decks for 2 nights as they waited for salvage crews to arrive. The crew was still aboard on August 23, 1920, when one of the crew, first mate Fred Rock, suffered an onslaught of appendicitis. Thankfully, he was able to be brought ashore, where emergency surgery was successfully performed. A salvage mission ensued. Grain was removed from the Phelan's hoppers and blow-dried, but the Phelan itself was left sitting abandoned in the water. Eventually, it was put up for auction, where its ownership was won by the John E. Russell Wrecking Company of Toronto. It took them a while to actually move the Phelan due to extenuating circumstances, but once they did, they brought it to Kingston, where it languished, unused, for 3 years. The Phelan, upon her sinking in 1920, had been declared a total loss, which meant that she needed to be re-registered if she ever hoped to sail again. She was meant to carry grain, but these plans never came to fruition, and the boat was sold again to a man named Howard Stanford Gerken. The Phelan was towed from Ontario to Buffalo, New York, where she was refitted as a sandsucker and renamed the Howard S Gerken. A routine trip for the Gerken saw her steam from Buffalo Harbor up the side of Lake Erie to her usual digging ground near Presque Island. There, she would anchor and load sand or gravel by sucking it off the lake's bottom. When her holds were full, she would make her way back to Buffalo, where the cargo would be removed from the ship and put onto the docks. On August 20, 1926, 6:10 a.m., the Howard S Gerken departed for her final voyage. Like usual, she headed up the side of Lake Erie towards Presque Island, arriving at about 5:25 p.m. The ship took her time loading up with sand and gravel, and by the time she was ready to depart, it was 8 p.m. on the 20th. Her trip back to Buffalo was interrupted by a developing storm. At 8:25, the wind shifted south, increasing to a heavy gale with rain and hail. Soon after, the weather took a further turn for the worse, waves beginning to crash over the sides of the deck, and the ship began to list heavily into the wind, which the captain, John B. Gamble, found concerning and unusual. He ordered some men below deck to check on the cause of the list. The cause became apparent pretty quickly, as water was found to be rushing into the midship compartment on the starboard side of the boat. It was clear that her hull had been compromised. Since the storm only seemed to be increasing in intensity, Captain Gamble ordered the Gerken to turn back to Erie Harbor. At the same time, the rest of the crew was tasked with running the pumps and siphons in an attempt to bail water out of the ship. It was no use, though, as the water coming into the ship was too much and overwhelmed the equipment. At 10 p.m., Captain Gamble dropped anchor and stopped the propeller in order to divert all steam power to the pumps and siphons. Still, the machinery was not able to keep up with the amount of water rushing in through the hole. The boat's list began to increase until it was so severe that the entire starboard side was completely submerged. All throughout the ordeal, the crew of the Gerken attempted to signal for help. They burned flares, aimed lights at the U.S. Coast Guard station on shore, and tapped out an SOS on the ship's wireless radio. The passenger steamer North American heard the call, but for some reason was unable to respond. One radio station on the shore did pick up the distress signal, but that radio station was in Hamilton, Ontario, and thus would have to relay the distress signal across several other stations until rescue services in Erie, Pennsylvania were able to be notified. Meanwhile, the increasingly desperate crew hauled a mattress up onto the aft cabin, doused it in kerosene, and lit it on fire in an attempt to draw attention from any other ships that might be nearby. After the first mattress burned to ash, they lit a second one on fire, and then a third. This method worked, and around 11:30 p.m., the fires were spotted by T.H. Heeman of the Maitland No. 1. Heeman, who was usually the first mate, was filling in as captain for the time being, and was actually a few miles off his usual course due to the storm. So it was a strike of pure luck that the ship was in the vicinity of the Gerken that late evening. Heeman immediately redirected the Maitland toward the Gerken, sailing her straight into winds of up to 82 miles per hour. The Gerken's anchor broke away as she waited for help, and she began to drift dangerously amongst the waves, water pouring into her firehold. The crew was finally ordered to abandon ship, and they all donned life preservers, launching their lifeboats with difficulty in the darkness, and tying them to the ship so that they would not drift apart. They got out just in time. Not long after they launched the lifeboats, the Howard S. Gerken slipped beneath the waves, her generators still running and her lights still on, but thankfully, not a soul left on board. The crew of the Gerken was still in peril, though. They had to bail for their lives because the storm was producing 15-foot tall waves that sloshed over the short metal sides of the lifeboats. At the same time, they were still trying to signal the Maitland, shooting flares and waving flashlights in the air to show their position. Despite Captain Heeman's determination to help, it took a frustrating 3 tries to line the Maitland up with the lifeboats, as the wind and waves kept blowing it further than it meant to go. Eventually, they did manage to drop their anchor in a relatively safe location and lowered their rope ladders. From the first lifeboat, all 9 men made it safely up the ladder. However, from the second lifeboat, 5 different men jumped at the ladder at once, causing the lifeboat to turn over and dump all 11 men into the water. Howard S Gerken himself was one of these men and was tossed into the side of the ferry before he managed to haul himself up onto the ladder. Several other men managed to hoist themselves up as well, but 4 did not: Herman Wageman, William Logan, First Mate George McMinn, and Richard Freeman. Maitland remained at the scene and continued to frantically signal for assistance. This time, multiple ships heeded the call, coming to help search for the 4 missing crew members. After a few hours of searching, the captain of the Maitland decided he needed to bring the exhausted survivors to shore, and that they could rejoin the search for the 4 men later. For 16 of the 20 men aboard the Gerken, the trials of the previous night were over. Herman Wageman, though, continued his struggle for survival for another several hours. He and another man, who he either could not or would not name, floated together for hours until eventually Herman's companion slipped under the waves and did not come back up. Bruised and battered, Herman ended up washing ashore 15 miles north of Erie, Pennsylvania. He had swallowed a lot of water and had suffered from exposure, but ultimately, he was alive. 2 more bodies, that of William Logan and George McMinn, were found on August 25th and 27th respectively, but the body of the last crewman, Richard Freeman, was unfortunately never found. Tragically, both George and Richard had survived a previous ship sinking. It seems a cruel twist of fate that after escaping the bottom of the lake once, they were doomed to it only a couple years later. And that is the story of the Howard S Gerken. I would like to extend my incredible gratitude to the Hagen Historical Society, specifically Pauline Stanton, for all their help with my research. Thanks to the materials they provided me with, I was able to get a complete history of the Howard S Gerken, which made scripting this video incredibly easy. Anyway, if you're still here, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful day, or night, depending on where you are, and that when you go to bed tonight, your pillow is cold on both sides. Bye-bye.